And the book that we are going to review is Rokda by Nikhil Imandar. It's not a review, but rather more of a conversation around the book. I hate using this word review because at the end of the day, who am I to review somebody else's work? But I think there are a lot of insights to be drawn from the book. It's primarily around the different business cases, or let's say the stories of individuals who have been very successful within the Indian context, very nuanced in terms of calling out some of the areas that are absolutely critical for being successful while doing business in India, but otherwise in general. And I think I'll just handpick one of the examples. Of example, this millionaire cabbie about which Nikhil has spoken about in this book. Everybody knows in India at least the name of Meru Cabs, which was owned by Neeraj Gupta, and how that story kind of evolves, and out of all the odds, how it turns out to be a successful business. But I think if you read this book around 7th, 8th page or so, I think Neeraj very clearly, although he he has this very clear statement where he calls out that irrespective of the kind of business that he was doing, he had this mantra where he would, first thing is to sort of recover his money, make sure that he's operating at reasonable margins, and then above all, never ever lose money. But at the end of the day, the story is much more than just like 3 statements. And I think there are a lot of takeaways in the book. I'm not going to narrate what's written in the book, but rather what I want to talk about is some of the principles that he's spoken about. And I think one of the most striking thing that you see when you read this guy is that this acumen that Neeraj had around constantly adding value while he's speaking to the customers. But if you look at the definition of the value add, I think it's way more sophisticated than we would think of it in a life, for example, in general terms. So, for example, if he's going for a corporate meeting, despite of the fact that he does not come from that kind of a background, a sort of a corporate setup, he would still make sure that the way he dresses up, the way he speaks, comes across, all of that kind of is kind of very presentable, so that he can woo the customers into making sure that they have a conviction in not just what he can do, etc., but also he kind of resonates very organically with the personality of the gentleman across the table. So that's one very striking thing that I noticed in the book. The second thing is that I think one thing that he realized was that the impact of government policies can have on the overall businesses. Very clearly, in the days of those license Raj, how this whole environment where, because some of the licensing is some of the ways that licensing was done was extremely difficult in those days, acquiring licenses to sort of run these cabs on the roads, and because of that there was this artificial scarcity that somehow, although despite of the fact there was enough cabs available, there was no dearth of the physical infrastructure available, the raw brute force human resources were available there, but because there were not enough licenses being sort of issued by the government, and because of that efficiency, this whole artificial scarcity got created, and therefore other companies started sort of competing and eating up into the part of the business, wherein this could have been an industry that could have scaled for pretty much everybody, at least for the next coming up few years. So very important factor that how government policies can make it so hard for businesses to run. So if you are in a startup and let's say you're speaking to some of my friends who are getting into this whole gaming kind of application development and stuff like that, and I think the jury is still out how much of this could be monetized in what all ways, considering the aspects of gambling and the money that is being put to stake by different people who don't fully appreciate the sort of business model behind it and so on. So I think you need to be careful that what is it that you're doing, which could be really long run. So I think that definitely is a very clear sort of a hint there in the book. And another thing that sort of came to realize was that this sort of appropriation of one concept that is applied elsewhere would work here as well. So for example, the way they were initially managing cabs was a very, very asset heavy model. So they basically, the companies owned all the sort of all the assets, which were cabs in this case, and therefore it meant that all the sort of maintenance, the servicing, the damages, etc., In fact, there was one example where it's been quoted that a driver, out of frustration, just bangs the car on a a pole or something like that, because just because he doesn't care, it's not his cab, he's not paying for the EMIs. So in that scenario, how do you take care of the assets and so on? And then all the operating cost that comes along with this also becomes a very, very critical aspect. So it's absolutely important to understand that not every business model can be as it is replicated elsewhere. And I think the company really became sort of cash positive when they transitioned from that asset heavy model to a more of a technology driven organization, where they kind of went into this hybrid model where they were not owning as much cars, but the cars were gradually owned by other people, and some of them were driver themselves, but they were kind of provided this layer of governance and technology that allowed them to provide best services to their customers, and continuously put in the quality and technology framework that allows them to sort of charge a bit of a premium because of the quality that they were providing and the kind of predictability that they have in their model in terms of providing services, etc. So very important factor there. I think another thing that you learn from this particular example is the fact that this open mindset, wherein transitioning from the place where you completely owning the business and taking all the decisions, so you're like this one-man army, to transitioning into something that is much more scalable, although you have less stakes in the company because you've brought in more partners, you've raised more capital, and you've kind of formalized the board members, the sort of a board that will take collective decisions, and also wise enough to accept that at some point in time you have to transition away from this whole model of being the business owner as well as the management, because sometimes it could be very counterintuitive, and especially when you have investors in place. I think it is best to sometimes have somebody who could make sure that they bring in this independent view about what is the best way to run the bank as opposed to building the bank, as they call it, right? So I think that was another important factor, and clearly see this very sharp business acumen despite of his knowledge, understanding, his kind of a track record of where he's raised so many rounds of money for different kinds of businesses, is still kind of ready to step back from the position which was operating and pivoting the whole business model into more technology driven sort of architecture. So very, very impressive sort of personality on that front. And another thing that you kind of realized was the very important thing I was discussing with one of my friends other day, and by you were talking about something, and I just mentioned the term like negative profits, and my friend immediately said, there's no such thing like negative profit, but there's only profits and losses. So if you're negative profit, you are incurring a loss. I think he was right, but he's right in a very general terms. But I think there are far more deeper implications when you dive deeper into these definitions purely from a finance perspective. Because I think the definition of loss from an accounting perspective could be much wider. So you could make losses because your operating expenses are very high. So you're kind of spending more money to manage things rather than making business itself, rather than what business is bringing in through revenues. Or in another case, this may so happen that you are sort of buying costlier, selling cheaper, in the sense that you're not really making any profits, you're losing market. You may have your valid reasons to explain it, but whether it's sustainable or not is another story. So that could be another. Or sometimes if you're writing off your assets and stuff like that, that could make your profits go down, and therefore you may not be making profit, rather it may look like losses. But the term within finance typically used like negative profits is very confined to the areas where you're only comparing the operating expenses. So which means, for example, let's say if I sell a product and if I make money more than what I had incurred to get this product to the customer, then I've made some profit on it. But let's say just to run this business, the operating side of it, I'm having much more expensive, the electricity, the rent and blah, right? All that kind of stuff they're much more than the profit that I'm making. So purely now the business here it's not the case when the business is not profitable, but rather it is the case where the way I'm operating this is not very effective, and therefore I'm losing money. And why I speak about this particular example in detail is because this is exactly what happened in the case of Meru Cabs. When they owned all the company assets and they were trying to manage all the cabs that they had on the road and paying for their services, their damages, and etc. It was a very complex model to manage, and it worked in Singapore, but it couldn't have worked in India because of the fact that Singapore model. The companies can own assets because, one, the quality of drivers is superior, and the second, that there's a lot of protection from a government perspective, and the businessmen are sort of relatively looked at least in those days, were looked at in a positive light as opposed to how it stood in India. So that model wouldn't have worked in India. But when they were owning all those assets, they had to paying for maintenance for all those assets. Therefore, the operating expenses were much higher. So they were making money, but they were losing a lot more money to maintain those assets. And I think this is where the genius of Neeraj comes in, because I think when they sort of raised more money, brought in a board, and then they mutually agreed to bring in a new CEO, I think one of the things that they did was to move away from this model of owning all the assets to become more asset light and migrate more towards this hybrid model where they will create this technology layer and not own as many assets. And what that meant was that operating expenses were directly brought down, and over a period of another few years or so, they started becoming cash positive. So it's exceptionally important when we're talking about profit, where you're spending more, whether this is your core value proposition that's hurting you or whether this is your operating side of it. I think that understanding is something that you can clearly see. But the more interesting fact for me was that transition, despite of the fact that he was such a sharp guy, as I said, that's a very well established, proven track record to run different businesses. The differentiation really came from the fact that they brought in a CEO who sort of made this proposition and made it happen. So the story kind of revolves around those lot of principles, a lot of incidents that speak about such areas. So I'll not go any further than detailing out what's in the book. Not a very costly book. I bought it really long back, and I encourage you to read this, and happy reading.